Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Jack, and I hope that you've had a great start to your MTG Arena collections. If you've been keeping tabs on any of the things that have been going on in the community, you'll know that a major point of discussion right now is how the economy in MTG Arena is in need of some serious help. So with that in mind, I figured it'd be great if I created a countdown video to make the best use of your Mythic wildcards. And so today we're going to do a top 10 countdown of the best Mythics to work with. And again, this is out of Amonkhet, Hour of Devastation, Ixalan, and Rivals of Ixalan. After this video, I'm also going to do a countdown for rares and then also general strategy to make the most of your resources and opportunities to have the best collection you can to create the most amount of decks. And so be on the lookout for those videos. They're on the way. But without further ado, let's get into the countdown. Coming in at number 10, we have Azor the Lawbringer. Now, Azor makes the list simply because he fits perfectly into what most control shells are trying to accomplish in their game plan. That game plan typically looks something like answer all the opponent's threats with counter spells and removal, and then eventually untap, play a big threat, and finish out the game with that threat. Now, most of the time, these control shells are only running anywhere from 2 to 4 big bombs or game-ending cards, and so their focus is mainly to have a concentrated amount of removal. With Azor, you're obviously going to play this card at a sorcery speed during your main phase, and so that trigger of being able to prevent your opponent from casting instants or sorceries on their next turn oftentimes is enough to where you can untap and then just run away with the game from there. For those of you who remember Return to Ravnica, most of you will remember that games would just end when one player would cast a high-costed Sphinx's Revelation. Oftentimes, the life gain and the amount of card selection made available to that player who resolved the Sphinx's Revelation would just be way too much to overcome and would ultimately end in that player winning of, 5 to 10 turns later. So in this case, Azor is great because you get that trigger every single time he attacks. And so he's both a Sphinx's Revelation and a bomb of a finisher for any player that is able to resolve and then untap with Azor on the field. Now, the reason why Azor isn't higher up on the list is because of the fact that Ravenous Chupacabra is out in full force right now. Ravenous Chupacabra is an uncommon, and so most players, or at least the ones that were mindful of it, started with 4 copies of it just because you have enough uncommon wild cards to be able to get that many Ravenous Chupacabras at the beginning. So with Ravenous Chupacabra out in full force, you're not going to have as much of a success rate with Azor the Lawbringer simply because Ravenous Chupacabra gets around that instant and sorcery speed protection that Azor typically tries to rely on. And coming in at number 9, we have Angel of Sanctions. What's great about Angel of Sanctions is that it is essentially an Oblivion Ring on a modestly beefy 3/4 stick. So Angel of Sanctions is both a threat that has to be dealt with and a catch-all for your opponent's threats. But what puts this over the top and onto our top 10 list is that last ability, the Embalm ability. If your opponent is able to deal with Angel of Sanctions, guess what? It comes back again so long as it wasn't exiled. And coming in at number 8, we have a tie between the Locust God and the Scorpion God. Now, the reason why these two creatures make the list is because they're sizable bodies that represent a significant clock, so your opponent has to deal with them. And your opponent can't just block these creatures forever because their abilities allow them to continually grind out advantage as long as they stay on the field. But what really puts these two over the top and onto our top 10 list is that last ability. This ability will allow you to continually replay this threat until your opponent either exiles it or a player wins the game. Coming in at number 7, we have Kumina, Tyrant of Urkaza. Now, the reason why Kumina makes the list is that this card comes with a wall of text that essentially says, when this card stays on the field for too long, run away with the game in stunning fashion. One of the downsides to Kumina is that you are going to have a bit of a deck building restriction and that you have to jam as much merfolk into the deck as possible. However, this isn't actually that big of a deal simply because you have a lot of really synergistic merfolk that will work well with Kumina. You've got Merfolk Mistbinder, you've got the enchantment Deep Root Waters, All of these cards together synergize for an efficient aggro deck that, with the help of Kumina, allows for you to reload and continue to draw threats for your opponent to have to deal with. If it weren't for the Merfolk Matters deck building restriction, I honestly think Kumina would probably be in the top 2 or 3 of this list. At number 6, we have our first Planeswalker, Gideon of the Trials. Now, the reason why Gideon makes the list is because of how effective his abilities are for just 3 mana. Ultimately, you're going to want to play Gideon in some kind of control shell, perhaps Approach to the Second Sun, but he could really be played in just about any deck. Now, the reason why you might want to consider playing him in a control shell is because his abilities do what control decks are generally trying to do. 1, lock down the opponent's board and deal with their threats. He does that quite well with his first ability, in that every turn you essentially get to negate the most potent creature threat that your opponent has to offer. Now, once you've taken full control of your opponent's board, Gideon converts from being something to lock down a threat to an effective 5-turn clock on your opponent's life total. What's even better is Gideon is indestructible while he's a creature, so he can only be dealt with through an exile effect like Vraska's Contempt, Cast Out, or Ixalan's Binding. Now, coming in at number 5, we have Vraska, Relic Seeker. Now, the reason why Vraska makes it ahead of Gideon on this list is because of Vraska's history so far in Magic the Gathering Arena. For those of you who weren't a part of the beta prior to the NDA release, at that time we only had Rivals of Ixalan and Ixalan. And with just those 2 sets, Vraska the Relic Seeker was probably the best Mythic in the best deck at the time. That deck being blue-black control with a splash of green for Vraska. The reason why Vraska was so good was because blue-black control had all the answers for just about everything except artifacts and enchantments. When you included a couple of copies of Vraska, however, you had the answers for any potent artifact or enchantment threats, and it was a bomb of a threat that you could get off of a Azcanta trigger. Now, once you've resolved Vraska the Relic Seeker on the board, and let's say your opponent doesn't really have anything that needs to be imminently dealt with, Vraska the Relic Seeker is pretty much a 3-turn clock in almost all cases, simply because you're going to +2 for 2 turns, and then on the final turn, provided you still have a threat on the board, you can -10, put your opponent to 1 life, and swing in with some 2/2s with Menace. Now, just as a final note for Vraska Relic Seeker, the reason why she isn't further ahead on this list is because with the additions of Amonkhet and Hour of Devastation, there's plenty of more tools for other decks to be able to deal with her presence on the board, and so she might not be as strong as she was in just Ixalan block. Coming in at number 4, we have every control player's worst nightmare. Now, the reason why Carnage Tyrant is so effective is because it basically blanks all of the common forms of removal that players are playing right now. Off the top of my head, I can only think of Settle the Wreckage and Vona's Hunger as ways to reliably get Carnage Tyrant off the board. And even with Vona's Hunger, you're going to have to make sure that Carnage Tyrant is the only thing on the field in order to ensure that your opponent has to sacrifice Carnage Tyrant. Now, before I tell you what number 3 is, I just want to say that for numbers 3 and 2, I had a really hard time deciding which of these should be ahead of the other, simply because they fill similar roles. But without further ado, number 3 is Hazaret Fervent. Now, the reason why Hazaret the Fervent makes it so far down the list is because he effectively fills the role of being a curve topper for the best aggro decks in the game, namely mono red aggro and red black aggro. Both of these decks are usually playing some very efficient, aggressive creatures in the 1, 2, and 3 slots, and so being able to play Hazaret the Fervent on curve after curving out with those efficient creatures is usually enough to end the game outright. Most decks that are being played right now don't have the ability to deal with a mono red or red black aggro going off on curve, and so that is why Hazaret the Fervent is in at number 3. And if you couldn't guess from my comments on Hazaret, coming in at number 2, we have Rekindling Phoenix. Now, for mono red aggro or red black aggro, Rekindling Phoenix is great, but it's not as good as Hazaret usually. But the reason why Rekindling Phoenix is higher up on the list than Hazaret is because of the factors involving the economy in Magic the Gathering Arena. Generally speaking, Hazaret's only going to fit into those 2 decks, where Rekindling Phoenix can fit very well into any deck that's going to be running red. Now, talking specifically about Rekindling Phoenix, what makes this card so great is that it's a recursive threat that has to be dealt with twice, or it needs to be exiled. And so usually that means that your opponent is going to be spending 4 mana to exile it, or 2 cards and anywhere from 3 to 4 mana trying to deal with it as well. So ultimately, it rarely results in a situation where you lose tempo on the opponent, and the opponent actually has to lose value in order to deal with it. Being a 4/3 flyer, it presents an easy 5-turn clock, even if your opponent is at 20 life, and so that is why Rekindling Phoenix is in at number 2. And finally, the number 1 mythic you should be spending your wild cards on in Magic the Gathering Arena is the Scarab God. Similar to our tie at number 8 with the Locust and Scorpion God, this card shares that recursive threat ability that those two had. But what puts the Scarab God ahead of those two mythics, and indeed every other mythic available in the game right now, is the combination of its activated ability and its upkeep trigger. Between these two abilities, it only takes a few turns of Scarab God being on the field before you've completely run away with the game. Now, an important thing to know when using the Scarab God is how to set a stop in your upkeep or toggle full control mode on your opponent's end step before you get to your upkeep. The reason why is Magic the Gathering Arena is going to want to resolve the Scarab God upkeep trigger before you have the ability to go ahead and respond to it with activating the activated ability. The reason why you might want to do this is because obviously the activated ability adds another zombie for the upkeep trigger to take into account. So that means you get to scry an extra card and deal an extra point of damage while gaining an extra point of life. Doing that over the course of multiple turns usually adds up to an incremental advantage that, in addition to creating free 4/4s, well, not free, 4 mana 4/4s that don't cost you a card and usually come with an enter the battlefield trigger, usually that's just enough to run away with the game and your opponent doesn't have much available in terms of recourse. Even better, this card is so versatile in that it can fit into a control shell, a mid-range shell. There's plenty of options available, and so not only is it the most powerful mythic in the game right now, but it's very versatile, and you don't feel pigeonholed into a single type of deck. It's not like Hazoret where it's extremely powerful, but it's usually only good as a curve topper in a low-to-the-ground aggro deck. And just to give you an idea of how powerful the Scarab God is, there was a night recently where we were streaming on Twitch for a full 30 wins. We tried to hit the daily cap, and we succeeded in doing that. But what's important to note is that in those 30 wins, I want to say about 5 of them were the result of me playing a Scarab God and then the opponent instantly conceding. It really is just that powerful of a card, and that's why the Scarab God reaches number 1 in our top 10 mythics you should spend your wild cards list. If you found this video to be helpful in making the most of your limited quantity of wild cards, be sure to like and subscribe. Even better, you can reach out to me on Twitch or Twitter by clicking on one of the links in the description down below. And with that, I'll see you next time.